Well, hey there, and welcome to yet another one of my cheesy YouTube videos. Good thing about owning a bunch of junk is you got plenty of chances to shoot videos. Behind me is my 1999 Dodge Dakota with a 2.5 Jeep four-cylinder. I bought the old truck on purpose because I actually wanted that Jeep engine in the Dakota, and they only did it from like 96 to 2000, somewhere around there. And it's turned into my go-to truck. I've been using it for everything because even though the body's a little beat here and there, it's been a really good truck. But this weekend we left Tractor Supply, 3 bags of feed and back, nothing too much. And then all of a sudden I couldn't shift, and it was like the clutch was out. And I limped it 30 miles back home, checked the fluid. The fluid is fine in both the hydraulic reservoir and in the transmission. The transmission wasn't boiling hot. And once I got it going, I could shift it without the clutch, and it would shift pretty decently unless I was, going 30 miles an hour or lower. So I'm a little perplexed on what's wrong. I got in this morning, I cleaned my shop, got in the truck, figured I was going to play hell trying to get it into the shop so I could go ahead and pull the tranny. Shifted fine. So here it is sitting in the shop. I'm perplexed because if the clutch plate went to crap, well, then it wouldn't pull worth a darn probably. I'm hoping that it is the pilot bearing. The pilot bearing is what supports the input shaft, and it's inside the back of the crankshaft. Pilot bearings get very little use. The only time they spin is when you got the clutch pedal pushed in. But when the clutch is out and it's driving, the pilot bearing's not spinning because the input shaft's spinning the same speed as the crankshaft. But if the pilot bearing were to start to go bad and start to want to drag, then that would cause a problem. So I'm thinking it's either the pilot bearing or it could be in the tranny. Well, let's hope it's not the tranny. I've been really impressed with this truck. It's been a really nice truck. So I figured I was going to pull the clutch out of here. I got a clutch ordered. I got the hydraulic master cylinder and slave cylinder assembly ordered, pre-bled. And I got a pilot bearing and a throwout bearing. It's all waiting for me at the parts store, supposedly. So whatever I find wrong, hopefully I can get it back together today. Okay, it's actually been a couple days and I've got the clutch out. Usually a clutch job for me. When I was young, I could knock this clutch out. I'd have it out on the ground probably in 2 hours, but I don't move at the same pace anymore. Kind of fat, don't fit underneath the truck when it's on jack stand. So anyways, and I'm not in a hurry. I suspected the pilot bearing as a possible culprit, and I believe I'm right, because this is the outer race of the pilot bearing, and the needles were just laying loose. Obviously, the pilot bearing was bad. Pilot bearing, in this case, it's in the flywheel. Sometimes they're in the crankshaft, but they're in the same spot. And they support the input shaft. And like I said earlier, they only turn when you got the clutch pedal pushed in. But what a lot of people do is they'll do a clutch job and they won't mess with the pilot bearing. And I can understand that because like I said, they don't get used that much. But this was dry as a bone. There is absolutely no lubrication on this whatsoever. I believe it was just hanging up. The clutch itself looks beautiful. I think the kids who own this truck did a clutch job. They didn't bother with the pilot bearing. They didn't bother with the throwout either, I don't think, because it rumbles when I turn on it. So I'm going to replace the clutch, replace the pilot and the throwout bearing because it comes in a kit. Don't think I'm going to touch the hydraulics, the slave cylinder or the master cylinder. I Googled my symptoms. Clutch works fine when it's cold. When it gets hot, it stops working. A lot of people saying your slave cylinder. Well, unless something's changed, a slave cylinder and a master cylinder is basically a piston with seals on it. For it not to work properly would mean that the fluid needs to push past that seal. And if the fluid pushes past that seal, it's either going to drip under your dash where your clutch pedal goes through the firewall, or it's going to drip into the bell housing where the slave cylinder rod is. It's not going to bypass the piston on either the slave cylinder or the master cylinder without leaking out or filling into the boot. Sometimes it'll leak and it'll get into the boot for the rods going into the master cylinder or the slave cylinder, and all you got to do there is peel back the boot and then fluid will pour out, and then you know you're bypassing. I think I may have mentioned that possibly there's something in the transmission getting hot and binding, but I think that the hypothesis is wrong, and that's because I should have still, when I pushed the clutch in, it should have still broke the connection between the engine and the transmission, because that's what a clutch does. It opens up that connection to where the engine and tranny are no longer theoretically connected to each other. The rear main seal is leaking. That rear main seal needs to be fixed while I'm at this point. So the dry shaft, it came out with, now this is a single cab, so I don't know if the 4-door or the club cab, whatever they call it, has a carrier bearing, but mine doesn't have a carrier bearing. So all I had to do was use a 3/8 wrench and take 4 bolts out that held 2 straps that held the rear U-joint to the differential. 3/8 combination wrench is best there because of the angle of the drive shaft. Just piddling with it to get to them. A straight shot with a socket would probably be a little harder. It took 15mm wrenches to take the cross member out. There's also a bolt that holds, I believe, the brake line to the cross member, which took a little fishing to get to. I used a 1/4-inch drive, 1/2-inch socket on that. That cross member was a bear to get out. First, there's 4 bolts on each side. You got to take a socket on an extension, go through the frame because it's a double frame, but the holes are provided to get to it. I got the 4 bolts out. I got the bolts off of the engine mount to the cross member, but I had to beat that cross member out of there. I mean, I beat on it for a long time. Holy cow, it drove me nuts. And when it finally dropped out from between the frame members, that truck shook. So I know them frames kind of went back in like this once that cross member got out, which tells me it ain't gonna be no fun putting it back in. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The bell housing bolts to the engine were, 18. They were 18 millimeter socket. Mine, they were extremely tight. A little bit PB blaster just did the trick. The crankshaft position sensor, I thought by looking at it that connects to the engine block, but it didn't. It connected to the bell housing. So once I pulled the bell housing back, I had to get back up in there, and I think it was a 7/16 or 12. I just used a long extension, reached up in there, took the 2 bolts out and worked the crankshaft position sensor off of the bell housing. The starter on the 2.5 mounts up from underneath like a lot of old GMs used to do. I did not have to touch the bolts on that. So there's 1 plug on the tranny, and that was on the right-hand side towards the back, and it came right off. I'm just trying to help you out here in case you got to do this job. The engine supported with the little scissors jack that I got, and blocks of wood, and I had to drop the exhaust off at the manifold. It would have been nice to pull that whole section of exhaust off, but that also has the oxygen sensor. So I just knocked it loose at the manifold, kind of forced it down to allow the bell housing to go past it. The flywheel, I'm not doing anything to it. I'll probably scuff it up with maybe 80 grit on a orbital sander. Just give it a scuff. The shift tower, floorboard popped right out by hand without no tools. And there was a couple bolts missing from the boot. Obviously this been out before. And there was a bell housing bolt missing too. But you're supposed to push down on a collar and turn it clockwise, and it'll snap out and come up, the shifter will come out. That wasn't the case. There was 4 bolts that were 8 millimeter that held the shift tower together, and when I took them out, my shifter and everything came out. Put it in a high gear. Don't put it in low gear, put it in a high gear. That way, when you go back together with it and you're aligning, you're trying to get your input shaft to line up with the splines. If you put it in a low gear, one little bit of turn on the output shaft, because that's all you can be able to do is turn on the output shaft, will turn that input shaft a long ways. And physically, it's almost impossible to do because it takes so much energy. So if you put it in high gear, a little turn on the output shaft will be a little turn on the input shaft. So, but it's got to be in gear. Either that or you don't have to be, but you may find yourself really playing with it to try to get them shafts, them splines to line up. So, I've got a good bit of work to do on here. I'm going to do like I said, the rear main and everything else. I'm going to get parts. I'm going to give y'all a break. I'm just using my wire brush to clean the splines on the input shaft so that the clutch disc slides on there. So that the clutch disc slides easily on it. Hit the bearing surface of the input. This is the part that goes into the pilot bearing inside the flywheel. Doesn't feel like it's all marred up from them bearings being bad. Now I'm going to put some of this lubricant that came with the clutch on the splines. I don't usually put lubricants on the spline, but since I got it here, I'll put it on. I got the new throw-out bearing in place, and I went ahead and installed the clutch. I installed the rear main, flywheel, and clutch. I used my alignment tool to align the clutch disc before I tightened down the pressure plate. I tightened down the pressure plate with the cross torque from this one and up to that one, and I continued doing that until it was all drawn down good and tight and torqued to the specifications. And then I pulled the alignment tool out. There's a right way and a wrong way for the disc. There's a right and wrong because the inner hub of the disc, if put in backwards, could prevent the friction surface from being squeezed between the pressure plate and flywheel. I think I've done that before many years ago. I think it was on an old Ford tractor. Make sure the transmission, when it goes together, that you watch your hoses and lines, which may want to get pinched between the bell housing and the engine block. And I'm almost ready to go ahead and roll it together. This cross member is going to be a pain in the ass. So let me get the tranny bolted to the block before I start crying about the cross member. Okay, I'm sliding the tranny into the engine. I got a bolt started. There's this little pin type deal on the bottom that was already there. I am probably about a ½ inch from having the gap completely closed. When you're mating the tranny to the engine, do not force anything. Do a good job at lining your friction disc up with your alignment tool before you tighten your pressure plate. Kind of make sure your tool looks like it's centered. Try to get your tranny at the right height when it starts to go in, so that your input shaft will start to engage the splines on the friction disc. I went ahead and just stuck the drive shaft into the back of the transmission, so I had something to grab a hold of and twist on the shaft to kind of move the input shaft, rotate the input shaft to get the spline to line up. In my case, I'm pretty darn certain that they went right in because I've not been able to turn that drive shaft. So then as soon as I realized that, I stuck my finger between the tranny and the engine and used my finger as a gauge, and I determined that I had about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch left, which told me the splines would have to be engaged by then. So what I was dealing with was the input shaft lining up and going into the pilot bearing. And all I did there is I just monitored my gap all the way around the tranny to make sure it's even all the way around. And then I wiggled, what I always called wiggle and jiggle. I wiggled and jiggled and pushed on that tranny until I could get the one bolt started. I wiggled and jiggled with that bolt in, and that kind of bolt worked as a leverage. And as I wiggled, I kept tightening, and I kept wiggling, and I could keep tightening, and the gap was closing until this pin right here is almost all the way through, and that's been my gauge, just watching the gap close. So I just got to keep on wiggling and jiggling and pushing and working that bolt. And I got to look up top, and I got to make darn certain that the lines and hoses and stuff up top aren't going to get pinched in between the tranny and the block. So that's where I'm at. I'm going to keep wiggling and jiggling and watching, monitoring everything until I get my gap completely closed. Then I'm going to throw enough bolts in to know that she's lined up and mounted. And then I'm going to go ahead and try to get this cross member in so I can get the jack out from underneath here. Well, I've got the clutch in. I've test driven it. It shifts really nice. I like the clutch. This clutch seems to be a little softer as far as pedal pressure than the other one. And for me, I like that. Everything went together fine. The cross member that I was really worried about, it went in easy because if you look at the frame, just behind where the cross member mounts, there's a little step in the frame. So the cross member will shove up between the frames at that spot. And then for me, I just shoved a little stool underneath there, propped up the cross member. Then I was able to take a hammer and drive it forward and into place. And then the bolts went in pretty easy. There's no need to bleed the clutch if you don't open up the clutch anywhere. And actually, as much as my clutch system has never leaked, just messing around with it down below, there was some drips on where the line goes into the slave cylinder. Kind of got me a little bit bothered because I really didn't want to go pay for another one when this one had been just fine. But once I had it bolted in place, it stopped leaking. So I'm thinking just everything moving around allowed a little bit of fluid to bypass the hose. So I'll keep an eye on that. I'll keep an eye on the fluid. I'll keep an eye on my engine oil to make sure my rear main doesn't start to drip. Rear main came out pretty easy with just pried it out with a screwdriver, and then tapped the new one in with a little bit of hammer and a blunt type of punch, and it went in pretty easy. Kind of went in too easy. Well, it went in easier than it's a rubber clad on the outside. It's not metal clad. So the press fit is not the same as if it was a metal clad. So anyways, I'll keep an eye on that just to make sure everything's fine, that it doesn't start leaking. But everything went good. Clutch is in, everything works fine. I hope this video helps you. I know I didn't show you step by step, but there's only room for me underneath there. There's not much room for me and a camera. Please share this video. Hit the like button. What are them other cute YouTube things? And remember, if you love life and learning new things, go aimless.com.